Thanks, everybody. It's great to see everybody here, and it's great that so many people were able to come out to GitLab Commit. We're excited to share a little bit of what we've been doing at GS and how we're trying to transform the experience, not just for developers in general, but for the whole organization and what's coming in the future, and hopefully some things that can help everybody here as well. I'm fairly old. I've been working in finance and technology for a long time. For a long time, really, as a developer and a team manager in the electronic trading and algorithmic trading space. And it's really only in the last year and a half or 2 years that I've switched over to the SDLC Engineering side. And I run the US SDLC Engineering team in New York, Atlanta, and Salt Lake City. Goldman Sachs, most people probably kind of know what we do, global investment banking, securities, and investment management, but it's actually a lot more than that. We're branched out recently, over the past several years into the markets effort for consumer lending, the new credit card that we're doing with Apple. There's other financial services apps that help consumers, with their budgeting and that kind of thing. So, that means we have to be a lot more nimble than we were in the past. Before, we might be doing things that calculate overnight risk models and many different things that are your usual investment banking type of things, but now, that you're developing things that are going to run on people's iPhones, you need to have a different sort of development infrastructure to do that. So the SDLC Engineering is what we call the organization that's basically supporting the about 9,000 engineers across the firm, providing them with source code management, approvals, testing infrastructure, ways to do releases, and all the sort of things that let them have a great developer experience and get their software into production. We're also driving the bus on strategic things that we're working on, new platforms like GitLab, but also supporting the legacy products. A lot of that, probably the vast majority of that $36 billion revenue number that you see right there, a lot of that is running on the existing SDLCs that we have. Some of it's on GitLab, but we're helping teams to sort of migrate and manage how they're going to make that change onto the new infrastructure. But in addition to that, we support, we have sort of columns within our team that support languages within the firm. So like the strategic Python stack, software acquisition. We don't just let anybody download anything. You have to get approvals for licenses and vulnerabilities before we can ingress software into the firm. But also newer things like open source contributions, like we were talking about in the session before. There's a lot of developers these days that not only want to be able to, from within the firm, make contributions to open source projects, but also want to take code that we've developed at Goldman Sachs and give it to the outside world as a new open source project. So we have, an open source area where we do that. Also working with the teams on cloud strategy and where we're going to go in terms of, cloud native, multi-cloud, all the different ways that we're doing new cloud things. We've been involved in the cloud for a long time, but a lot of the efforts from before were really just taking and using infrastructure in the cloud as an extension of Goldman Sachs and just running our software there. So in a way that's sort of renting someone's computer, which doesn't really count as cloud stuff, I don't think. But so I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the dark times that we were in before GitLab to give you a picture of what we're dealing with. So we actually have about 10 different SDLCs at GS right now. I think we just closed one out, so we might be down to 9. But obviously, having 10 different SDLCs is not an ideal state. But they've sort of grown organically over the years for different purposes. So some of you may have heard of Slang and SecDB, which are our proprietary language and a proprietary database that we have that runs a lot of important things within the firm. We have the Train, which is sort of like a calendared release system where it's, say, you're going to release every Tuesday night, and no matter what happens, Tuesday the release gets cut and out it goes. It's good because it keeps you as a constant cadence, but it doesn't necessarily give you much empathy in terms of changing your releases. There's another platform which was sort of a predecessor to GitLab that gives you that sort of style of workflow, but it was all developed in-house. And many of the ideas that are in these SDLCs were developed, they seem obvious now, things like having matrix approvals or required steps and pipelines. But 8, 9, 10 years ago when people were coming up with this, it was fairly new at that point. We have mono repos, we have multi-repos. For different situations, we have Wavefront, which lets you push something out into production immediately. We have things like the Train I said that move in a global lockstep. We have products that are released individually whenever people want to. And we also have things that never release, which also is not exactly a great scenario. And these are things where it's software that a team developed that maybe generates a report, or it's a trading application that people use that actually works great. You don't really need to do another release. And so it's, we have, I think in one of the SDLCs, out of about 15,000 projects that are in that particular platform, there's maybe half that haven't released in the past calendar year. And it's not really a problem. It's just something where in the future, we'd like to keep up a development cadence so that if we need to do continuous integration testing with a new OS, if we need to do any type of new feature like that or any new type of testing, we have the flexibility to do that. So there's different things that the different SDLCs are better at and worse at. So some of them can do things where maybe it's an environment where the runtime speed isn't critical, but you need to be able to make a change in 10 seconds. Maybe it's something like a risk model that is going to need 10 different types of approvals, because obviously that's calculating very important things for the firm. You'll need approvals from developers, from managers, from compliance, from legal, from whoever. And the SDLC needs to be able to handle that and make sure that nobody's making any mistakes. But also, there's 20 or 25 years of improvements in customization in the kind of surrounding infrastructure of the SDLC. So we have things like the application directory, which maps from a business unit to a family to an application to particular deployments of that application, so that you can see exactly where everything is in production, QA, development, what infrastructure you're using, all that kind of thing. The software project registry, which has really important information about different things at the firm. So for example, a project might have a flag that says that it has personally identifiable information inside it, so there'll be certain restrictions on that. Or it might be a project that's involved in financial reporting or customer reporting, which means you have to be very careful about certain other things. All of these things are tracked inside there, so we have a complete view across all of our platforms of what types of restrictions are on what. And then you have other things like dynamic compute, for example, which is our sort of on-premise cloud infrastructure, which we use. Now, obviously, we use the real cloud, but we have our own internal thing that helps us reuse hosts and make sure we're taking maximum advantage of the machines that we have. So over the years, people have realized that some of these things are 20 years old. It's getting sort of dated at some point that we need something new. But what comes next? How do you replace it when people are comfortable in it? There's millions of lines of code. There's thousands of builds a day. People are so comfortable that they're willing to use the 15-year-old IDE because everything that they need is self-contained right in that one place. And so part of what makes that difficult is because we've grown our SDLCs into an ecosystem. That's what I call it, but it's everything that you think of as an SDLC plus more. And because many of the things that we had at GS were designed in-house, so it's our own workflow, it's our own tools that are doing code reviews, for example, and whatever, and just surrounding a minimum amount of external tools. Everything that's involved in it is very tightly coupled with everything else. So your IDE even is customized so that it understands the repository and the way that the builds are going to work so that things are automatically flagged. The deployments and the issue trackers and the builds and the testing are all linked in together so that everything can be controlled in one click. The emails that come out know about the way the deployments are happening. All of the regulatory and compliance stuff is actually linked in even with the IDE in some cases, so you can't even accidentally hit the key to promote something. It tells you what's coming next and what controls you have to meet. It makes it really great for people because it's such a comfortable environment. It's mistake-proof. All the things that you might need for matrix approvals are right there in it. And it gives you a really powerful environment. So this gives you a great platform. The problem is it's sort of both simultaneously its greatest strength and its greatest weakness, because the tightness of the coupling of the components makes it very difficult to individually replace any of the ones. So if you want to put in a different IDE, for example, how are you going to swap that out with the other components? Or if you change the source code control system. Everything, for example, in one of the SDLCs is expecting a CVS-style workflow, so Git isn't really going to work in the same way, and that's going to cause chaos through the whole thing. So what do? That's the thing. And so we started out, to define a new strategic direction. And we started an evaluation process with an internal group that was working on one of our flagship projects. And we said, how do we get a modern Git-based solution for developers? So people want the Git experience, developing on feature branches, merging to master, and those kind of behaviors, instead of the old days of working with CVS and just checking everything into the head. And then when two people check in, they'd get in a big fight about who broke the test and whatever else. And we're also evaluating, vendor solutions for this versus an in-house developed platform. So, one of the things that GS is trying to do is to pivot away from, for example, having a global team of 20 people working on an SDLC platform to buying a vendor product, which can probably work much better and have a lot more resources to develop new features. We also wanted to tie the use of strategic things like moving to the cloud writing cloud-native applications, Kubernetes, all those things to the strategic platform as a way of encouraging people to move from the legacy stacks to the new stacks. So we didn't want to enhance the existing stacks with the capabilities of doing this because we wanted to encourage migration to the new platform. And then we also, of course, wanted to have a really strong CI/CD offering as a part of the selection process because that was one of the most important things that we wanted to ensure to make sure people are being agile, have a development cadence, all those kinds of things. So how do we get a whole new strategic ecosystem? How do we get something that has the same type of user comfort and the mistake-proof environment, but at the same time, how do we give teams the flexibility to innovate in a highly regulated and controlled environment? You know, how can we handle everything from iOS applications to risk models to Python stack stuff, notebooks, all that kind of thing? Because many of us have been developers, and the last thing you want is to be locked down into some templated system where you can only input the name of your source code files. You actually want to have something that gives you the freedom to innovate, but still have that control level around it. So picking GitLab was the best decision we could have made, and after the initial work to get it live, it's been a huge success, and everybody is absolutely delighted with it. But there's some things I want to talk about as sort of what's worked and what hasn't, and why the things that have worked have worked. And I think one of the most important parts is the GS technology integration. So I mentioned before about the software project registry and Aptor and dynamic compute and those other things that are there. We didn't want GitLab to be an island. We wanted it to be integrated with the GS, you know, identity and authentication systems, the way we distribute source code through the legacy deployment mechanism. So even though you're using the strategic SDLC, you're still able to deploy to your hosts in production. All these important ways that we've sort of linked it in are critical to people being able to take advantage of it. In other words, you don't have to, you're going to rewrite your build to use GitLab, but you don't necessarily have to move to some whole new platform that has its own machines and whatever. We've also made it so that GitLab is the on-ramp or the runway or whatever you want to use airplane metaphors to getting out into the cloud for GS people. And so that's been a huge way of encouraging people to do that, even though they really like GitLab, so they're moving on their own. But we've also integrated with the GitLab webhooks for automation, so new ways of doing things like upgrading people's builds when we have ways of, when we need to release a new version of our tools that are underlying the release system. That's submitted by, we have bots that do different things, and the bot will automatically submit a merge request onto people's projects, and they can choose to accept it when they're ready and move it and roll it out with their code. But we can also track metrics around that for seeing, you know, okay, it's been 2 weeks, how many people haven't accepted the merge request, and really use automation to make, you know, developers' lives easier and better. We don't just cram some change onto them, we let them do it in time, but make sure that they're doing it. And having, you know, GitLab as the center of the new ecosystem is a critical part of it. So there's some graphics there that are sort of examples from the merge request page, which is where really the central point that we're trying to make for tracking information about people's builds and what they're doing. And the changes people are making. So there's an example of like a Sonatype CLM scan that we're having there. And then also our quality assurance engineering metrics, there's an example there of somebody who increased their code coverage by 51%, which is great, but they don't even meet the basic level of testing maturity model, and that's sad. But also, just from a general user experience, in terms of rapid adoption, so after it went live about, I guess, a little more than a year ago, with the first initial flagship project, we sort of opened it up to the world. We weren't really marketing it yet, but we were opening it up to the world of GS. And we had 1,600 users start using it in the first 2 weeks without even pushing it at people at all. And so that shows you sort of the pent-up demand, I think, for a modern tool set like this. I don't think there's ever been anything in the history of GS that 1,600 developers have started using in the first 2 weeks without even making them. And some of them were Hello World apps, but still just the idea that people would be going in to experiment with it and start using it and start to convert their team's build is amazing. And part of the reason why it works, I think, is because people have used Git before. Even if you've, whether you've used it at another firm or you use it at home on open source projects, so people are used to sort of the workflow, the tool set. And some people are still learning about it, but the great advantage of, something like GitLab versus an in-house developing is if you have a problem or an issue, you can just Google it. You don't have to go, find someone at GS that knows about some custom tool and how it's going to work and all that kind of thing. So that's where we are, but how do we get here and sort of what's the roadmap for the future? So we're definitely still on the road, I think, like a lot of people. It's been like a rocket launch, though, and we've actually, in some ways, sort of outgrown the GS on-prem infrastructure that GitLab is growing on right now. So we have a new offering for GS that's running. It's going to have the GitLab site running in the cloud, but bridged over onto Goldman so that it's still usable from everybody inside, and it's actually going to support both cloud-native deployments and deployments inside GS. The GS tech integration has been really important, but it's gonna, oh, sorry, forgot to change the slide. The GS controls implementation is really important because it's, there are many more things that we're gonna be adding on, sort of like first-party code scans that are being done by technology risk, additional controls that are going to use information in the software project registry so that things like externally facing client websites will get automatic extra scanning, all kinds of stuff that we're building around GitLab, but still having it as the center of what we're offering. And I think, you know, the most important part, though, like I was saying before, is the human perspective of the users, because our job sort of as the SDLC engineering organization is to deliver a great experience for the developers at GS. And people love it. It's the first thing I've been involved with where people actually, apropos of nothing, will say how much they love GitLab and how great it is and how much they like using it. Nobody ever said nice things like that about the old in-house tools, which is kind of sad. They were good. They weren't bad. They were, you know, they did a great job. But I think people can tell that, you know, GitLab is sort of that next generation step, and it really can be like the strategic platform for what we want to do. You don't need to market it to people. Just through word of mouth, it sells itself. I don't know if the GitLab salespeople want me to say that, but it really does. They'll want it, and they'll make changes to their builds. So we have people in some of the older build systems that have, you know, maybe giant static data blobs in their subversion repository or something like that, that we've been asking them to get rid of for a long time. But because one of the conditions of going to GitLab is to clean up your build, they're actually cleaning up their builds, which is great. So it's a great carrot to lure people along with. But also, like I was saying before, it gives people that freedom to innovate. You can set up your build, you know, that works well for an iOS application. Python people can do a different thing. You know, the risk model people can do something else. People that are doing machine learning can set up their own type of build. All of that is possible, and we can still have the controls that we need to make sure that in a highly regulated environment, we're doing what we need to do. And then also, you know, the reduced cycle times, I think, are a huge part of it. So we have one team that used to only be able to do a release. They could finally get everything coordinated and do a release, I think every 2 weeks it was. And now they can do one and do another one 5 minutes later if they want to. And that's something that can really help power their business because they can, you know, you can change the color of a button, do another release. It's fine. It's not really hurting anything. So that's all great, but sort of what lessons have we learned along the way that can help others have as much success as we had? So I think one of the most important parts is the way, you know, we treat our relationship with GitLab as a partnership. So the open communication that we have, the way that GitLab openly plans their releases, it's much better than sort of an old-fashioned vendor-style relationship where you just buy something and fill out a support ticket when something's wrong. It's been fantastic to have the transparency, you know, into the way features are being planned and for us to be able to have input into that, which is hugely important for us because we have new ideas and new ways that we want to use the product to drive it strategically from within GS. I think it's also really important to make sure that you're using the features that it offers to integrate with your existing technology. You know, for people that are just a startup, it's okay because you can go with what's there. But for somebody like us that has a whole, you know, host of legacy things that you're dealing with, it's super important to be able to link in with those and make it so that GitLab isn't an island, like I was saying. Also, you know, the automation that's there that's important. And, you know, we've worked with GitLab, like I was saying, on functionality and what we're going to do there. Also, you know, I wouldn't exactly say we're agile, but we're making progress in moving the organization that way, embracing DevOps, making that have a much larger role in a lot of the strategic projects that we're doing and bringing on more SRE-type staff as well to do that. And also focusing on metrics to help drive adoption. So, you know, thanks to GitLab, we have a lot more insight in addition to what GitLab's offering, but also with the QAE metrics that we have from quality assurance engineering to figure out things like, you know, are people keeping good health on their master branch? Are there certain developers that always check in code that break, you know, the release and all that kind of thing? And then, you know, I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and Goldman Sachs was very, very happy to become an investor in GitLab. Goldman Sachs invests in a lot of things, but this is something that was there was a lot of help from the developer community about this because we loved it so much as users of it. It was just a natural thing that we would, try and work together to become investors. So the bottom line, we use it. People are demanding to use it more. People are actually angry at me when they can't import it onto GitLab yet, which is unusual. I've never had somebody get mad at me that they couldn't use a piece of software before. We love it, and we believe it's the strategic platform to take us into the future. And I hope this has given you a fairly short but helpful view into some of the things that help us. I could talk about this for hours, and I'd be happy to. So if you have any questions or anything like that after this talk, I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about any part of it. So thanks very much.